Great, and welcome. Welcome to the 5th annual AAAS Science Film Showcase. It's brought to you by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS, with very much appreciated help from the Jackson Hole Science Media Awards, and heartfelt thanks to this extraordinary national treasure that's the Coolidge Corner Theater. It's beautiful. We started 5 years ago at a sort of a small lecture hall in Harvard, so a much less palatial, beautiful space. And this is our 5th. So that was we started in Boston, and this is our 5th, and we're back here in Boston again. I am Bob Hirshon. I'm AAAS Program Director for Technology and Learning, and also host of the daily radio feature Science Update. And if you don't hear it on the radio, you can get it at scienceupdate.com. I'm also a proud graduate of the Boston University Science Journalism Graduate Program, right here. And I think we have some folks from there here, but they're not cheering on cue as they were supposed to do, but we'll just keep moving. AAAS, it's the oldest, largest, and I think funnest general science society. It's based in Washington, D.C. now. It was founded in 1848, though, right here in Boston, and we're probably best known for publishing the weekly journal Science, and have since 1880. And you've probably been reading a lot about efforts to keep government agencies like the EPA and the Department of Energy and the USDA and the CDC and NASA and others, crazy though it may seem, have them focus on science as opposed to politics or business or whatever else. And if you've been following that, you've probably been reading a lot about us and our CEO, who's a physicist and former New Jersey Congressman, Rush Holt. And we've got info on the back table, and I promised the folks at membership to urge you to join. We have this thing going on between now and Monday where it's crazy inexpensive to become a member of AAAS, and you get Science Magazine every week, and help us do what we're doing, which is so important right now. And that's it for the AAAS aftermarketing spiel. Moving right into the Science Film Showcase, we will be featuring short clips from 5 different films. After each clip, we'll invite the filmmakers and or scientists up here for some conversation, questions from the audience. We'll just sort of do it informally. We don't have mics set up, so we'll just point to you and yell it out as best you can. We've only got 10 or 12 minutes of conversation for each film, but if we have time at the end, we'll invite the guests back up to continue the conversation, but then there's another movie coming up here a little bit later, so we can't stay too long. So be thinking of what questions you might have. And our theme is sort of how filmmakers, when doing their art, work together with scientists, and the creativity that happens, the tension that happens between them in creating the final work and making it work as a story, but also get the science right. And so now, to kick things off, our first featured film is just one example of the amazing work being done by Days Edge Productions and its 2 founders, Neil Lowson and Nate Dappin. Both are PhD scientists, field biologists, as well as skilled filmmakers. They produced the series Think Like a Scientist for Howard Hughes Medical Institute and Nautilus magazine. And because they're so short, the films are so short, not Neil and Nate. They're not short at all. Because the films are so short, we can show the entire episode instead of just a clip. And so here is, to kick things off, Vulcan and the Power of Ideas. Wow, amazing. You can see why that was a winner at the Jackson Hole Science Media Awards. Such a beautiful film. And now I'd like to welcome up to the front Nate Dappin, Neil Lowson from Days Edge Productions, and movie stars and scientists, Melissa Franklin from Harvard and Tom Levenson from MIT. Come on up. Actually, yeah, just stand around here, I guess, and as soon as this light...
Just hover?
Right. Just hover. There it is.
I'm wearing the same...
Yeah.
Awesome.
Here, you can be the holder of the mic for now. Where you can be seen. Okay, so So if you guys have questions, put up your hands. But first, I was just going to ask, you guys normally shoot films with lots of plumage and beautiful, things in nature. Was it a challenge to do a science history type film?
Yeah, so our training as scientists is as evolutionary biologists, and so we're used to filming outdoors and filming critters, things that sort of have these really natural visuals that are appealing. Yeah, I guess we were a little apprehensive about making a particle physics film and a film that has a lot of history of science. But we were fortunate to, in our initial research, to find out that there's a collection of historical scientific instruments on the Harvard campus, and there's this amazing great refractor telescope where we filmed the interview with Tom. And so there ended up being actually a lot of cool things to show, and we just had to think a little bit more creatively about visuals.
And a particle accelerator on Harvard campus.
And a particle accelerator.
And some critters.
Yes.
Some critters.
Yeah,
How did you guys find each other?
two wonderful critters to film as well.
I felt like a critter.
And I also want to give significant credit to our animator, Dustin Grella, who does these wonderful animations in chalk. He actually draws them in chalk and films the chalkboard as he animates them and creates some really, wonderful visuals, we think.
Wow. And for you guys, for the scientists, how was it working? I don't know if you've worked much with in film, but did they get the science right? Did they? Was it a struggle, or did it just flow?
First of all, I'm not a scientist. I play one on TV. No, I'm a science writer and a insufficiently popular historian of science. And I have been a documentary filmmaker, so this was actually, for me, very odd to be on the wrong side of the camera. I would occasionally interrupt them to their annoyance, say, what lens is that? Why are you doing that? But no, the only thing that was surprising is, I know how much I demanded of people who were in front of my camera and how long it took and all that, and I tried to be empathetic to the subjects, but it's really different when you're the person sitting in the chair and they've just asked you the question for the second or third time, and you're wondering, what did I do wrong last time? So that was, and then I realized, no, they're just, they do it just to make sure they've got get options and ways to think about the story, and so I hopefully found it useful for if I ever do that to anybody again myself, I learned something.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. And Melissa, how did they get the science right? Was it easy? Was it difficult?
First of all, dark matter's probably there. So, it was an analogy, right?
Vulcan definitely isn't.
These guys are great, actually. I rarely get to talk to biologists. And I like them. They're critters, too, in a way. But I thought, I don't even know what I did. I came in that day and they did everything. So I did feel a little bit weird. But I felt weirder watching the movie.
And this is the first time you'd seen it, right?
It is the first time, and the first time I've met this guy.
There you are.
And I did know what Vulcan was, though. I knew what Vulcan wasn't. But I like I think these guys would probably have more to say about, probably more interesting about what it's like to deal with scientists.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Or, yeah.
Quasi.
And you can answer that if you'd like, and if people want to put up their hands. The first one I saw was the fellow in the dark jersey right there. Yes, you. Yell it on out. Yeah, you're the one that just said, Drat, it wasn't me, but it is you. Yes.
Yeah. Having followed your work since actually meeting you guys at Smash last September, I've just been really inspired watching a lot of the videos and the way you portray scientists. So my question is, do you have a selection process of choosing scientists that are naturally great communicators, or are you going to teach them on the spot, or you have a way of making that passion really come out on camera?
I mean, I think that if you can make scientists feel comfortable, they're actually super charismatic and excited about the work that they do. There's nothing a scientist likes to do more than talk about science. So I think that the key is probably just making people feel comfortable that you're gonna honestly portray them. And so the selection process usually has to do with finding the scientist who is the expert on the topic instead of finding who's best on camera. Certainly, I think that that's a losing strategy in the long run. You want to find the people who really know what they're talking about and can speak with authority about issues. And then, I don't know, I mean, I think it's really about trust and trying to build trust. And then also, as Tom pointed out, sometimes you have to say things 5 or 6 times and figure out the right thing, and you work together to get the right words out in the right order. And yeah, so it's kind of a process that way, yeah.
Great, thanks.
And it's whoever answers the phone, right?
Someone way in the back, but I guess I'll go right here.
In a way, this film made me think about the problem that scientists have a lot of the times, that is with negative results. So often experiments don't work out. And they're difficult to publish, right? But they're important. I wonder if you might have anything to say about that.
Yeah. So in my field, which is physics, we publish all our results. It can't not work out. It can only, you can put a limit on something. You can say it's not there. So it's much easier than biology. Don't ask me what they do. But I do think it's really important that people realize that we are making progress by getting null results. And that's really hard to get across. I actually thought the film did it nodded its head to that. Yeah. I think it's a good point, yeah. Oh, sorry.
I mean, the interesting thing about the story of Vulcan particularly is that this was a 19th century display of a real interplay between popular science media and the professional scientists trying to think about this problem, because some of the arguments about Vulcan were carried out kind of polemically in places like the New York Times, which made fun of professional astronomers who doubted the existence of Vulcan and were sure that it was going to be proved. I think what's striking is that people were able to publish all kinds of reports of the discovery of Vulcan that nowadays we'd look at and say, they'd never passed the smell test. But back then there was an enthusiasm for sort of a really broadly cultural enthusiasm for these kinds of questions. And that helped make this a lasting, 20-plus year story, even though really, I think people were beginning to suspect there was something wrong much earlier than the community finally publicly turned away from it.
And I saw one right here. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, we had one more thing to say, and then you.
Sorry, yeah, just to speak to that as well. I mean, if I would add that, if you think that the selection bias for positive results is bad in peer-reviewed literature, that's nothing compared to the selection bias in popular media coverage of science, right? And so for us, it was a real kind of privilege to tell one of these stories about a time that scientists didn't get it right, and yet to make an interesting story out of it. And I hope that going forward, more science media finds the value in telling these stories that emphasize the process of science and don't focus so exclusively on the results.
Mm-hmm. Just very quickly, one last thought. The other big part of the story of Vulcan is after it was clear that it wasn't there, there was some 30-year period when nobody dealt with the consequences of its not being there. And that, to me, is, for science, not for the popular media, the most interesting part of the story. Given that a brute fact is supposed to be able to destroy the most beautiful theory, why didn't it, in this case, for so long?
And right here.
Yeah, just a question about the whole process of putting this film together. You two had the idea of Vulcan being a great example of something that was fact that turned out not to be fact. And you got together, you selected or looked at artists who are scientists or historians. How scripted they what they had to use within their own expertise, feel that they understood, to be able to demonstrate how that could still exist today in a very effective way. How much of that interplay was scripted?
So how much was scripted, for the folks who didn't hear it, to make the story flow and to make it succinct, and how much And even the selection of this particular story, did that play into it?
None of it was scripted. I mean, we did this series for the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. This is one episode in a series, and so we had to provide them with a treatment, which ended up being pretty different from the final result of the film. It was a challenge to figure out the relationship between Vulcan and something modern that was going on, and I definitely, there is the sense that maybe we're wrong about dark matter when there's probably a ton of evidence suggesting that it is there, right? So maybe it's not the greatest parallel, but we were sort of restricted by the theme of Nautilus magazine, and the theme determined what this story would be about. Every month they pick a theme. This month was currents. And so the idea that we came up with, that we pitched to the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, was how the currents of scientific thought often determine how our views influence the course that science takes, and sometimes we're wrong about those currents. And so we debated about a variety of topics before we settled on this one. And it took us a little while to figure out the relationship between what Melissa does and the story of Vulcan that Tom has.
Can I just comment on that? They basically came into my office and sat me down and asked me to say something interesting over and over. Can you say something interesting? And then they just kept, they were there for, I don't know how many hours you were there for, just, can you just say something interesting? And
It's a good technique.
that's basically, right? That's, yeah.
And it was so
No,
hard
not
to get
that.
you to say something.
I know. I know, it took like hours. There's definitely no script.
They wouldn't let you leave.
I was in my office.
Great. Well, I'm sorry, that's all the time we have before we have to go on to our next clip. And please give another round of applause to these amazing filmmakers and scientists. And boy, so very short films, I think Like a Scientist, are quite short. Our next film is the other end of this, a 3-part NOVA special presentation called Making North America. And it features geologist and, as you'll see, aspiring golfer, Kirk Johnson, who's director of the Smithsonian Natural History Museum. And this series is just a tour de force. It takes viewers on a trip hundreds of millions of years into the past to see the birth and development of the continent that we see today. And it's the winner of the AAAS Kevley Science Journalism Award, presented later this week. And yes, Kirk Johnson could not be here, but we have folks from NOVA who produced the film, and book author and geologist David Montgomery, who also is featured in the film. So please, let's roll Making North America. So it's just, the thing, I watched that clip and it's like, now I get it. And that series was just full of those now I get it moments, and just amazing. So coming up to represent this film, our NOVA science editor, Evan Hattingham, NOVA senior executive producer? Yes, Julia Court, and from the University of Washington, Seattle, geologist and popular book author, David Montgomery. So the first thing I think, and I've known Evan for a long time, and he's a science editor and is working on these things from the start. It's a geology story. They're rocks. Are you thinking, how are we going to bring this to life? What are we going to do to make this active?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about a lot of geological processes is that they're the opposite of television. I mean, they're inexorable, very slow, and not a lot happens. Well, of course, that's kind of our stereotype, our image. And the idea for this series was actually born when NOVA's executive producer, Paula Absel, was in the Rockies, and a Park Service guide started talking about this range called the Ancestral Rockies. And she said, well, what do you mean the Ancestral Rockies? And the guide casually said, yeah, well, in fact, the Rockies rose and fell at least 3 times during the last 300 million years. And this blew dear Paula's mind. And along the lines of the landscape around you that you see, that you assume, a lot of people kind of just don't think about the scale of the incredible changes that have happened to, especially in iconic places like the Grand Canyon and Zion. So we set out from that moment of inspiration was born the 6-year struggle to develop and fund this series, which took on the impossibly ambitious task of trying to write a geological biography of our continent. And really, the key to try to solve the problem was, we had a wonderful, very energetic, genuinely enthusiastic at all times, sort of overgrown, brilliant teenager getting out, struggling to get out, from this adult geologist. So a very enthusiastic host, and we focused on very dramatic events that, of course, punctuated long periods of slow change. And we also focused on critical fossils that really dramatized and made things very, very tangible. At all times, we're trying to look at specific objects, specific relics from the past. That's what Kirk goes in search of, to bring these incredible processes to light.
Great, thanks. Do you have any thoughts on producing geology and versus some, perhaps?
I think one of the biggest challenges with geology is, well, one, the scale that Evan talked about. The scale of time, we're talking about 1 billion years from the beginning of North America to today, and the scale of space in this enormous continent. But one thing we struggled with constantly was that rock is totally fractal. So that looking at rock really close up and looking at rock far away, it looks completely the same. And that was a huge struggle when we were working on these animations, to how do you give the audience a real indication of how big this stuff is. And I think that was probably one of the biggest struggles in visualizing this.
Oh, interesting. And David, from your perspective, and you've actually worked on popular books, and as well as helping on this film. Any thoughts about getting across the idea of geology in film versus the books that you write?
Yeah, I mean, you do have the problem with trying to get geology on film, that rocks just sit there, soil just sits there. So you've really got to bring the excitement to it. You've got to bring the story to it. And so with the various films I've been in and filmmakers I've worked with, trying to actually figure out, what's the scene going to be? What are you going to actually do? How are you going to get some kind of movement and visual stimulus and really make the kind of thing that geologists can see with their 4-dimensional mind, and seeing through time and seeing in 3-dimensional space? How do you translate that onto a 2-dimensional screen in a way that will engage people's imagination and inspire them to be excited about science? And that's, I don't know whether being a book writer helps with that or not. I'd like to think that it does, but of course I'm going to think that.
Do you want to tell them about the scene that you're in?
Well, sure. I mean, I was approached, I'm a geomorphologist. I deal with the evolution of topography, so I don't do so much of the deep time story, but I do things that involve, say, soils. And so they approached me about, what could we do with a scene that would last a few minutes? There's a slot to fit it in terms of the program that would deal with the nature and importance of soils as the foundation for civilizations. And we sort of went back and forth and figured out a way to work that in a way that had me fly across the country to go to North Carolina. I'm in Seattle, but it was the right way to tell the story. And we had to get a little creative, and one of the things as a scientist in dealing with popular outreach science is sometimes you have to kind of relax and just go with it. And so, I encourage you to see, it's in episode 3 of this one, and we had a little fun with it. And that's also...
Turned it into a cooking show.
We turned it into a cooking show of sort of, how do you make good fertile soil? And so we actually brought a red checkered tablecloth out into a tobacco field, looked at how you would how nature would make good soil, and then we got out that most useful of tools, a shovel, and actually went out and looked at the soil in different places. And that's one of the things I was able to actually bring to the segment, was the idea that, well, if if you dig a hole in a tobacco field where it's been cultivated with an awful lot of fertilizer for 100 years, you'll find a very different soil than you would in the forest right next door. And so he put out a white tablecloth, put out what you saw in the tobacco field, dug a hole in the forest floor, and it's like night and day. And that's the kind of way to actually sort of bring excitement, I think, to an audience so they can appreciate the kind of stuff that geologists integrate over the timescales that we use or look at that most people really don't tend to think about.
Mm-hmm. It's visual. Questions from the audience? Wave your hand flamboyantly if you have a question, because I'm way in back there. Yes.
I'm interested to know, following on from this, how you choose to use a narrator. Was it through the whole way? Was that to give it life, or are there times when there's not a personality who's giving it? And sort of more broadly for science, you have to have that personality to really give it life to capture a non-scientific audience?
So the entire series was hosted by Kirk Johnson. And he's really the guide who takes us on this adventure across North America and back in time. But along the way, in that sequence, there was not a scientist, but in a lot of the sequences, he goes to these places and he meets scientists who help him interpret the evidence. And as Dave was talking, I was reminded, one of I think the great things about this series is when you go to these places with geologists, they look at the ground beneath your feet and they see a story. They can interpret the evidence and unfold this incredible story going back in time, and they know how to read the rocks. And we all found that really compelling and exciting. But yes, for this series, Kirk Johnson is the main voice, and then the voices of other scientists come in along the way.
Great. I thought he did a great job. And he doesn't look like Indiana Jones. He looks like a regular guy. And in one episode where he puts on this harness and he's talking about the Grand Canyon, and he just goes over the edge. Unbelievable. And you didn't expect it as much as if you saw, someone who looked like they were about to.
John Goodman, I think.
A little, yeah. So it's an amazing thing. Other questions? Yes, right there.
So I thought it was really spectacular, the use of the drone photography, and I'm wondering if you incorporated that into your other film projects and what you see of that opening up in this history.
Yeah, increasingly. I mean, in the old days, helicopter aerial photography was a huge production expense and was something to be rationed out. Now, any hobbyist, well, not any hobbyist, but a really skilled
licensed drone operator.
A licensed drone operator. And the skilled cinematographer can produce these kind of breathtaking results, and they crop up in many films. My favorite example of this is that we did a NOVA on the Duomo in Florence, on the riddle of the architecture of Brunelleschi's dome, excuse my mispronunciation. And the whole film was transformed by an astonishing shot which went from the main piazza in Florence, went right up the side of the Duomo and actually hovered vertically over the very center of the Duomo, looking down at the square below. And it's just an unforgettable image. And of course, this is Florence. And if you tried to get permission to do that, the infamous Florence bureaucracy, you would never have succeeded. And of course, what happened was the producer just slipped a couple of thousand lira into the policeman down in the square below. So, it's okay if I do this? Fine, no problem.
Great, thanks. Well, I just had one I had to ask because you mentioned Paula. How many novas get started when Paula Apsel comes back from a vacation and has this look in her eye, and then you're like, uh-oh. Thoughts? Frequently? Rarely?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Paula's an incredibly fertile mind. She's reinvented Nova many times over to stay. Nova follows a formula. A little bit of the voice of God narrator, but we take. She knows it's essential to take risks and take on a wide range of subjects in challenging ways for us to stay relevant. You know, public media has to stay relevant, and now more than ever, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. All right. And with that, I'm sorry we have to move on to our next film, but I did want to mention that David Montgomery, I mentioned he's an author, has some books. You have some books with you, right?
Yeah, I'm here on sabbatical for a few months. I got about a dozen copies of my latest book. If anyone wants to pick one up, I'll just have them outside on the way out, and feel free to stop by. It's called The Hidden Half of Nature, The Microbial Roots of Life and Health. And it's about the way the microbes inside your gut are the parallel of what works in the roots of a plant system and how important it is to the health of all the nature that we know. It's a very good book.
It sounds like a Nova.
Yeah.
Got shut to talk.
Okay.
All right, thank you. All right. Okay, our next film was produced by AAAS treasurer and biomedical entrepreneur David Shaw. And producing this film up at Acadia National Park spurred him to sponsor a major new initiative between AAAS and the National Park Service, and we're kicking it off at Acadia National Park. It's called the Second Century Stewardship Project. And the idea is that we're conducting critical scientific research at national parks, and then sharing the results with students through schools and with the public at large. And we're going to just see sort of the introduction of the film, and then a segment right at the beginning about a citizen science project. And then we'll discuss that. So please roll Second Century Science. All right, that's Second Century Science. And coming up here to represent this film is Mark Berry, who is director of the Schoodic Institute, which conducts research and education programs at Acadia, and Abe Miller-Rushing, a National Park Service scientist who collaborates with Schoodic. So come on up, Mark and Abe. Hi. So I guess, you know, the whole idea of conducting science in national parks, and you know, the idea that this is going on sort of behind the scenes, do you guys bring this to the public much? Do you interact with the public, or is it something that's sort of this parallel track? Yeah.
Both, ultimately. So Schoodic Institute's a nonprofit partner in this equation, and part of our mission is to advance ecosystem science and learning for all ages. And so the educational component is really important to us, but it's also fundamental to the mission of the National Park Service. And we already heard in the case of the NOVA series how national parks inspired that story. The Park Service receives over 300 million visitors a year that represent an extremely broad cross-section of society, both from our country and the world, and really represent an extraordinary opportunity to reach people that otherwise might not be reached with a science story. So not only are parks outstanding places to do science, they're outstanding places to connect with people about that science story.
Great, thanks. And Abe, so I was just going to ask you, the segment we just saw had kids doing, I guess, citizen science type projects. Can regular people, kids and lay people actually contribute to science research, or is it more of an education type thing?
Yeah, so this is, well, hopefully this question's getting asked a lot less now in terms of citizen science and contributing to it. So, of course, volunteers have been contributing to science as far back as science goes. Science originally, when the scientific method was developed, there weren't professional scientists doing it. It was volunteers. It was people who were trained in other professions who were doing science because they loved it. And certainly these days, with all of as rapidly as the environment is changing and with all of the challenges that we face with national parks and other areas, we don't have enough professional scientists or professional staff to collect the data that we need, or to even identify the questions that need to be asked. And so we need volunteers to help us collect the data, but they're not just collecting the data, they're also helping us identify the questions, analyze the data, and identify what we should do about the things that we're finding. And so yes, very much the volunteers are important in terms of doing science, and hopefully they learn a lot about science. As you saw in here, it's a way to really engage kids and adults in the scientific method and to really inspire them about discovery.
Great. Questions? Anybody want to? Right here?
I have a question about, I don't know how much you were involved in making of the film or more than other projects, but these remind me, I mean, it always kicks off memories for me back in elementary school watching what we call biology movies. You know, there would be, you know, you'd see a glass of water and then you'd see all the amoebas and things inside the water. They always be acoustic guitar music in the background. And often going slowly because it was winding at a slow speed. I was just wondering about the music in these. Do you have, is it all composed? Do you know, is this like...
Do you know? I know too.
Well, we were not involved in creating the music, any of the three of us. David Shaw actually was, so he worked with some musicians that he knows, and they gathered in a studio and put some new music together for the film. So
it's not anything that was already pre-recorded that you went and found?
No, it's new. So the soundtrack is brand new for the film.
Yeah, they produced it for the track, and it just won an award, right? It was one of the film was entered in a conservation ocean film, and it was the soundtrack that won a big award.
It was an Ocean Film Festival that just happened in the last couple of months, and yes, the soundtrack was a first place award.
Questions? Wait, I'm sorry. I saw one right here, waving, yes?
So I have perhaps a two-part question. So here, I guess that's just a clip. So we see the data collection, but we're missing the result. And the question, asking the question is there. Yes. The second part of the question is, how do you get citizen scientists? What's the mechanism that you use to get citizen scientists to ask me questions?
Maybe I'll take the first and give it to Abe. So the first question is related to the fact that we saw a clip which showed the educational process and the gathering of data, but didn't show the analysis or the results or the answers. And the film actually doesn't go into a lot of those stages for that project. The project, Dragonfly Mercury project, is one that started at Acadia. It's a partnership with the University of Maine and Schoodic Institute, and it was designed as a scientist-teacher-student partnership to engage students in the science, and particularly taking advantage of the fact that students are going to love mucking around in a pond, have a great learning experience, but also take advantage of the fact that by taking a sample, in this case a dragonfly nymph, they are going to be taking very high quality data. It's not going to be a question of how well they used the measuring instrument. And that sample will be brought back to the lab in this case, and the scientists in the lab do the actual measurement of the mercury concentration. So the data did ultimately go back into the classrooms so that the students had that experience of working with the data as well. But those pieces were not featured in the film. One of the aspects of our work in Acadia, our work with Acadia, is we have the opportunity to try methods like this, the scientist-teacher-student partnership, the specific project of Dragonfly Mercury. In this case, it was a pretty successful model, and it was picked up by the agency and is now at 70 parks across the country because it really works educationally and because the data has been meaningful. It has informed our understanding of mercury concentration in watersheds.
Did you want?
Sure, and I can take the second half of your question about how do you get the volunteers to be able to ask their own questions, is that right?
Yeah, on what mechanism you use to compile them or to stimulate?
for the questions. I think, you know, people are naturally curious. So actually the biggest challenge is actually getting them to recognize, getting people, students, to recognize that they can ask the questions, or in the case of a lot of kids, realizing that they have the ability to answer the questions that they're asking all the time, and that they can use science to do that. And so, you know, sometimes questions come up, you know, we've had their pollution problems. So there was on Mount Desert Island where Acadia is, there was people using beach monitoring recognized that there was a water pollution problem, and they were trying to figure out exactly how do we find the source of this problem and how do we kind of diagnose it. And so they realized they couldn't find a professional scientist to help them, so they ended up figuring it out, developing a sampling design, and kind of isolating the source of that problem. And I think that sometimes, you know, just recognizing that you can use that scientific method to solve the problem is actually the biggest challenge, the kind of empowering the people that it's not, you don't need a magical scientist to be able to do it.
How do you foster that institution from your side?
Yeah. In part, it's you know, working very closely with these students and telling them and helping them along the way as they're kind of asking questions. To say, you know, there's a lot of times they're very cautious at the beginning of asking their questions, and you're like, that's a really good question. So what about this or what about that? And then how would you answer that? And you know, the negative data that we came up with at the beginning. You know, a lot of times they're very concerned about like, is my hypothesis right? And a good question is interesting whether it's right or wrong, you know, or, you know, a good hypothesis is interesting, the result is interesting whether you're right or wrong. And so I think that a lot of it's just kind of working through the students, and it's different whether it's an adult audience or whether it's a student audience, but fostering those partnerships and fostering the partnerships with teachers in the case of the students is really helpful to empower the teachers to be able to help work with their students and be comfortable with the data and things like that.
Great, thank you. Another, right here, I guess.
What was the character of the problem that the citizen scientists found?
The water quality problem that I mentioned? It was a bacterial contamination problem, and so it was E. coli on a beach. Oh, and how did they solve it? So it ended up being, right, they isolated it down to a leaky septic, or a failing septic system, and it got fixed. So, and the beach is clean, and wow, kids are swimming in it again.
And right here.
Maybe they get to it in Ryan Park, but we live in a semi-fascist regime now that's attempting to quash free speech rights, would use negative results to disparage science and claim that they are just theories or that the scientists are lying. And so you also have a situation where, in this particular case, they want to cut off, they want to destroy the Clean Air Act. So is that dealt with in this documentary? And I think we all need to be scientist activists and fight the fight before it's too late.
And just for those who didn't hear, part of this question is, when you have negative science, negative results, can that be used to disparage science as a whole? And you know, and how do you feel about that? Because you know, they can say, oh, you guys don't know what you're talking about.
When people are questioning, well, yeah, one thing I just want to mention there is that science in national parks is actually quite powerful in that regard, and the science in Acadia and Great Smoky Mountains have really been a lot of the basis for a lot of our Clean Air Act and the regulations that EPA has put in terms of, in fact, the research from mercury research in Acadia has informed EPA's standards for mercury emissions from coal-fired power plants. And so because it's so visible, science in national parks can resonate and a lot more with the public, and a lot of, you know, a huge swath, you know, 300 million people show up there, and a whole lot more than that care deeply about national parks.
Right.
And just quickly, no, the film does not address the political climate. The film was actually completed last year. But either way, that wasn't its focus. But its name, the emphasis on stewardship, is meant to evoke the relevance of the science to something that people care about, in this case, the national parks. So the science is important for the agency's ability to care for these natural and cultural resources for future generations. And that, of course, has validity that goes beyond any shift in politics. And for some parks, including Acadia, the science was actually one of the purposes for creation of the park. So the founders of Acadia, and Acadia is also 100 years old, like the agency, envisioned the park as important for science. So it is a purpose of the park to advance science, and science is important for stewardship of the park, and that gets at the partnership that we now have between the Institute and AAAS and the Park Service to help advance science in parks.
Right. And I have a follow-up to actually, so I work on this project, so I know the answer to this, but what's next for the Second Century Stewardship Project? Because this is just basically a film about science, but the project itself is very specific.
Yeah, so the project is underway now, and we have already awarded a first research fellowship. We'll be continuing to award research fellowships for work in and relevant to Acadia, and be expanding that to other parks. Beyond the research fellowships, there are components of science communication training for the fellows and telling the story of science in the parks. There are components of making education connections, bringing educator ambassadors into the parks, and working with students, and finally a component of pursuing solutions to critical issues for science. So it's an exciting collaboration. I know on the part of Schoodic Institute, we're thrilled to be working with AAAS and bringing their national leadership for science to Acadia.
Great, thanks. And with that, thanks Abe and Mark. And our fourth film was the Grand Helix Award winner at the recent Jackson Hole Science Media Awards. So not only did it win in its category, but it was deemed the top film in the competition. And it's a fascinating look at the phenomenon of bioluminescence, or living light. And the title of the film is David Attenborough's Light on Earth. So let's have that clip, please. Wow. And I want to mention that the executive producer put that together for us. So that was segments from throughout the film brought together into one nice short clip. So that was above and beyond. And that executive producer is Ivo Filac, executive producer at Terra Mater Factual Studios. Here. Thank you. Here all the way from Vienna, Austria, to be with us. And that is, I've seen films on bioluminescence, and it's a naturally beautiful phenomenon, but I've never seen the treatment that beautiful or lyrical or comprehensive. You got so much in, and yet it didn't feel rushed. So. Yeah. So my question is, how did you do it?
First of all, I would like to apologize for my limited English. Also, I'm a bit tired because I came here and now it's 20 hours or so. Yeah, how did we put this together? It's a very long story because it took almost 2 years just to get the project started. The producer, director, Martin Dawn, who is from Emanet Films in Bristol, UK, is very experienced in low light and night filming, and he's very famous for that, developing things like that, cameras and noise reduction ways for the last, 20 or 30 years. And I think in the 80s or so, he did a first film with David Attenborough on bioluminescence. We even thought taking some pieces in there, but it didn't really fit. We said we don't want to have archive, we will shoot everything new. Yeah, so the start was a bit complicated. It took some time because nobody really seemed to have to trust into this kind of film. Martin Dawn came to us. Then we went to other partners, possible partners, potential partners all around the world. Most of them said, yeah, it's very nice. I can imagine a piece of 10 minutes or a quarter or so maybe, just to show nice creatures, whatever. People would be stunned and that's it. Then we managed to get David Attenborough on board and things changed, surprisingly. He was so enthusiastic about this project that he even released. I shouldn't have said that, but he did it for less money than usual. This just shows you how he was into this project. And then even the BBC stepped in, that refused to take the project before that, because it became clear that he would become 90 last year on the 8th of May, and the BBC wanted to have a proper show to celebrate his birthday. And so we had the problem of finishing the film half a year earlier, all of a sudden, which is a bit of, filmmakers know that it's not that easy. But we managed to do that, and so it aired on the BBC as well, and it was an overwhelming success for them, for us as well. So worldwide, we won the Grand Helix, and I don't know, in widescreen, two pandas. It was really, it was really great. And also for David, I think it's hard to imagine. He was 89 when he went to the dark woods in Pennsylvania, when he had to dig a hole in the ground in France, for example, in the middle of the night, because they had some glowing worms found over there. And so, and I remember that producer-director Joe Long-Crane and Martin Dawn told me that he even said, in the middle of the night, somewhere when they were finishing filming and trying to get back home, they were saying, he said that he would like to take some equipment with him to help the crew. It's not, so he's very helpful in this way as well.
Wow.
Yeah.
And just off the record, the camera turns off, does he turn, I guess you've already answered, does he turn into an ogre and he starts throwing things? And...
No, of course he has his bad moods as well, of course, as any person, I would guess. But he was so enthusiastic about everything, and he couldn't stop talking about it, and also got in touch with the scientists and did what he could to bring this whole thing, the whole film, to life. And I think it's his authenticity and his enthusiasm that drives the film. It gives the film another dimension as well. So it's not about only the visuals and the stunning music, it's also himself pushing it.
And that was another question I had, because you've done documentaries that are mostly voiceover, not hosted, as well as hosted ones. What are the differences? Is it more challenging or more advantages to having a host, whether it's...
first you have to have the right host, of course. So it comes with a person, with a personality. If people would believe what this guy is, or the lady, sorry, is telling you in front of the camera. The choice of the right person is really crucial for any kind of film project with a presenter. Mm-hmm. So, and we got the best one.
Great. Questions? Oh, right here.
Yeah, it was incredibly beautiful, and the music was beautiful, but why do you use anxious music with films like this?
Why?
What do you mean by anxious?
Anxiety-provoking music. I'm not saying it's bad music. You're not the only one.
I think we're going to discuss this for 2 or 3 hours now.
Did you try another soundtrack?
No. Everything was intentional. This was composed by a Scottish composer who never did this before. He was working on films. The Martin Dawn, the original director from Eminent Films, was asking for other composers with a big orchestra. This, I really say, American way of doing this kind of film music, and we refused. Yeah, but this is not when I first saw a kind of a rough cut assembly of sequences, they put together, Joe Longcrane, the director, put together soundtracks from science fiction movies that I recognized because I'm a huge science fiction fan. So I recognized soundtracks from Interstellar, The Martian, and other things. And it fit to it's always a question of personal taste as well. So for my personal taste, it was perfect. And so I thought, I said we should have a composer trying to get this kind of music and fit it to this kind, because what we tried to achieve with this film is to get across this atmosphere, this otherworldly atmosphere, along with this kind of, because you're kind of diving in different worlds compared to our own. Even if you see these woods in Pennsylvania, by day you wouldn't think that this is special, but if it turns into night, then it's another world, and we tried to accompany this with the appropriate music. And I'm sorry that you're now a bit afraid of that. I didn't want to do that.
An alien would pop out, yeah. And a hand shot up right there when you were talking about.
I thought the music was exciting. That I can find anxiety. So I have to come on the other side. That I found that it captured the water moving, it captured the isolation of the light, the bioluminescent things. So I think they all that stuff.
So we'll divide the room. So everybody who thought it was anxiety producing, come over here, and everybody thought it.
Yeah, but it's interesting, these kind of different reactions.
Right there.
Actually,
dolphin scene.
The camera was mounted in front of the boat. So we have a making of, which is unfortunately we don't have here, where you can see Martin Dawn, who is also the cameraman, and then sitting right in the front of the boat, and the camera is pointing down to the water. And so in one or two shots you could see that the boat was coming in from the left side. So. Yeah.
And the first hand I saw was right here. Yes, near the back, but yeah.
How often does the directing happen in Tasmania? I say hopefully because I'm from that part of the world.
In Tasmania.
Yeah, I can hear it. So I think David was saying lifetime event, and it's pretty much that. So it can happen in 1 or 2 years in a row, and then for dozens of years it won't happen anymore. So.
Wow. I saw the next hand was right here. Yes.
Yeah, so I was curious about the camera technology that was developed.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the cameras they used. Sorry.
But there's a camera invented for.
Martin Dawn is very experienced. He was developing his own camera technology in the past. In this case, he took some of his stuff and gear, and also some new cameras that are extremely good under low light conditions. But what you have to keep in mind, it's not only about the cameras, but also about the post-production, about the processing of these images. The noise reduction is extremely important, and the way they do it, you could do it, for example, you could even improve, so to say, make the black even darker, but then you wouldn't have the impression that this is natural, this would look like a CGI or whatever. And we tried, and this was also the reason that David in the beginning said that everything is real, because people would think that this could be done only in the computer. So the noise reduction is also very important during the entire production process, because it's not only the cameras, also what you do with the images afterwards.
Right, and I saw, I think I saw this person, yes, right here.
I was wondering, like, if you have a car, you need keys in order to start the car, but how do these animals, these cells, use their glowing power? I mean, how does it work?
You mean the scientific background of bioluminescence? I'm not the right person to ask. No.
Yeah. Oh, where can it be seen? Yeah.
This one. I forgot to mention that we have an American co-production partner on this, and this is not one of the broadcasters because nobody wanted to have it. It's Curiosity Stream. It's a streaming VOD platform that's run by Steve Burns, who is very famous in the community. He stepped in saying he's so excited about it, and especially when David came aboard, he said he doesn't have the money, but he would try and afford it, and so he was crucial for this project as well. So you can see it on Curiosity Stream online.
I think we had one quick question over here, if you still have it. Oh, right here, yes. Yeah, how do you plan for something like that?
There was no plan. Of course, you can plan certain things, but this Tasmanian blue tide, this was just by chance. Some people knew about the project, and Joe Longcrane, the director, once got a call from Tasmania from a cameraman that he knows, saying, we have a blue tide here. All of a sudden, it popped up just by chance. So we were very lucky to get this kind of sequence. And I realized that all of us had the same reaction. This was the right one. You laughed when you saw the dog, because everyone that saw the film, and you ask afterwards, everyone keeps in mind the dog. The dog and the dolphins are the crucial shots of these films.
All right, well, thank you. Let's thank again Ivo Filat, Terra Mater Factual Studios. Thanks. Okay, well, there's no other way to say it. We go from the sublime to the disgusting. In past years, we've followed up this film showcase with a big reception with food, and we didn't have a space here to do it this year. So I thought, okay, how am I going to ensure that no one's going to have any appetite whatsoever at the end of this so they won't miss it? And I immediately thought of Anna. Yes, Anna Rothschild, intrepid purveyor, I'm beginning to fall back into my Massachusetts accent, purveyor of the slimy, the smelly, the disgusting in the world of science. And our next clip is Gross Science from Nova Digital Media. And we have with us Anna Rothschild from PBS Digital Studios and Nova. There you are. You produce these every week?
Yes.
Are you worried you're going to run out of disgusting things to say or to write about?
I'm not worried about running out of disgusting things to say, but somebody should probably make sure I'm still alive at the end of every week, because it takes a lot.
All right. So I think the first thing I'm wondering is, do you have a long list of things in order of disgustingness? Okay, here's the thing. Do you have like the next 29 disgusting things lined up?
I always have about 10 story ideas that I want to do, and 5 in production at almost any time, even if I'm just in like the scripting or research phase. So yeah, I don't ever think I'm going to run out of gross stuff to talk about on the show.
And how did you get into this?
How did I?
Into the theme.
Right. So I mean, I think that I've actually pretty much been obsessed with gross stuff my entire life. My love of science itself really started when I was in about 6th grade or so, and my parents bought me a slime chemistry set, and I was hooked ever since.
And so it began.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, when I've been working at Nova for about 5 years, and when the opportunity arose to pitch my own series, the first thing that came to mind was, oh my goodness, could I do something about gross stuff? And Paula Apsel, who we mentioned before, was just like, all right, Anna, why don't you give it a shot?
Nice.
And here we are.
And I shouldn't fail to mention, this is another winner of the Kevli Science Journalism Awards that you'll be accepting this Friday. So
thank you.
Really, really great. Yeah. Questions from the audience? Oh, right there, yes.
Sorry, another question. How big is, this is amazing. Humor and everything.
Thank you.
How big is your team? How to do
Me? I should say that I have amazing interns every semester, and if you are in school and you would like to intern for me, come talk to me. But I have interns every semester who help me out, but it's mostly just me, so I write, research, edit, animate.
You do the animation too?
I do the animation too.
Wow.
Though, yeah. So I do need people to help though, and my interns are always really wonderful.
Great.
I should also say that it's kind of funny to be seeing this on a big screen because these are meant to be watched on like a cell phone. So this is the largest I've ever seen my face or any of my work. And I don't know. I think it might be better on a cell phone.
I saw right here, yes. Yeah.
What's the grossest thing, what's your favorite grossest thing, and also what's the grossest thing you've ever eaten?
I love that.
What was the second part?
The grossest thing you've ever eaten.
Oh, the grossest thing I've ever
And your favorite grossest thing.
Okay. Well, the thing I did a video on that grosses me out the most is tonsil stones. Which almost everyone in this room has probably had at some point. They're like little masses of food and bacteria and like dead skin cells that get caught in your tonsils, and then they smell really bad and you like cough them up and they're terrible. And the really funny thing to me is that video, it's one of the grossest things I've ever done a video on, but it is still my most popular video, I think because like most human beings have experienced this disgusting phenomenon and have just never wanted to talk about it with anyone. So the comments section on my YouTube channel has become this like year-long self-help feed of people just like sharing tips and tricks and like saying, oh my gosh, I never knew what these things were, thank you. And I'm just like, man.
It could be its own series, just on tonsil stones.
Yeah.
And disgusting thing you've eaten.
The most disgusting thing I've eaten. Man, I don't know. I guess like the obvious thing would be some crickets, but I don't know, that wasn't even so bad. The thing that was bad about them was that they were sour cream and onion flavored. And like, I think we're a little old. Otherwise, I don't know. I'm pretty adventurous when it comes to that sort of stuff, clearly. So, yeah, I don't know. Oh, I know what the most disgusting thing I've ever eaten is. Probably my own boogers when I was a kid.
You asked. Other questions? They're speechless. Wow. You've done it.
I'm curious about the person that you think you're addressing, your audience. Do you think an 8-year-old, an adult, or
Right, so I write the episodes for about a middle school audience, but I'll say that I have viewers who are adults and viewers who are 4, 5, 6, so when I'm thinking about who I'm making the video for, it's maybe a 7th grader or 7th grade reading level, but I know that there are going to be much older people and much younger people. And I also, try to put in jokes that maybe the 7th grader is not going to understand, but their parents going to understand a little bit more as well. So, yeah. And part of why I wanted to make a show about gross stuff is specifically to address issues that I think 7th graders, 8th graders are about to start growing out of. And I think that when people stop kind of loving gross stuff is when they start getting a little bit more self-conscious about their bodies and just more self-conscious generally in life. So part of the series and part of why I want to talk about gross stuff, especially with young people, is to get them to continue to ask questions and stay curious about their bodies and about, nature and science, and feel comfortable with themselves.
And have you done specific episodes on that, on things that are targeted to adolescents that they might be squeamish about?
I did an episode on periods last year. It was actually my Valentine's Day episode to everyone, to the hundreds of thousands of women who were going to have their period that Valentine's Day. And yeah, I mean, I made it specifically because I want people to feel comfortable. And it's just a frank discussion of like 3 surprising things you wouldn't know about menstruation. Go watch it.
Right here, I see, yes.
What takes the most time with this, since you do it all yourself? What's the time consuming?
You know, honestly, a lot of the time it's the research. Initially, it was when I was first starting out. It was the animation because I'm totally self-taught, and so, you know, the first highly animated video I did took a month. And that was mostly in the animation time. But these days, since I'm producing a video every week, sometimes every 2 weeks, the limiting factor is often just making sure that I have researched it really rigorously and that I've fact-checked everything and spoken with scientists and make sure that I feel really confident with the information. And I'm like super neurotic about that. So yeah, that's usually the limiting factor these days. But I mean, depending on the piece, the animation can take kind of a long time too.
That's amazing. I was just going to ask about, because this makes me think, when I was at WGBH, producers weren't allowed to do anything except do, you know, just a few things. You could write, you could appear on camera, and you could sort of oversee things, but you couldn't touch things. So the animation group had to do it. There are actual, I mean, they're like union infractions and stuff. If you moved equipment, they're like, you couldn't do that. Or if you tried to edit a sequence or something, no, you can't. All you can do is point. And it's changed so much, and I guess part of it's the technology.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's all democratized now. Like, okay, I realized the other 4 films that we saw were shot on like extremely fancy equipment and probably, you know, I'm sure just one of their cameras cost more than like the entire budget of my entire series. No, that's a joke. But you know, anyone really, if you can tell a good story, you can now make a film. I work with kids a lot of the time, just like making stop motion animations with their cell phones at this point. I mean, these are like middle schoolers, high schoolers who have that technology in their pockets, and you know, you can animate, edit, shoot, and tell a pretty darn good story with the equipment you already have at home.
Are there new technologies coming out that you say, oh, I can't wait to do that or get my hands on that?
Well, given that like 90% of my operation is me sitting at my desk with like watercolors, I don't think I'm the right person to ask about the technology. But I would love if somebody wanted to help me on that end.
Great. So you actually do old-fashioned type art and shoot it as opposed to doing digital?
I animate in After Effects, but all of many of the illustrations, and the illustrations, at least in the piece that you saw, were all done on paper. So they weren't done digitally. I did them myself and then photographed them, brought them into an animating program. That's a great question. So actually, a lot of the time I'll be talking to a scientist and I'll explain what my show is about, and they'll be like, oh my God, you have to talk to my friend. So that happens a lot. I also, you know, just read a lot of science news. And then there are the stories like the tonsil stone one where I just had one and was like, what the heck is going on? And you know, our bodies are gross. They're fodder for many, many, many of my stories. But yeah, a lot of the time it's from scientists. So the fig wasp one, actually, you know what? I think with this story, a friend of mine had told me about, a friend of mine who was serving me figs told me about it, and I was like, this is unbelievable. That's crazy. So that's actually how I found this story. But I then ended up finding a scientist who studies fig wasps to talk to about it. And I think I also ended up speaking to somebody who works in agriculture, in fig cultivation as well, for this story as well.
And has Paula Apsel ever come to you saying, Anne, I have the most disgusting thing I just discovered?
You know, it's so funny. Paula and everyone, not just at Nova, but at GBH generally, at our public television station, like, I just get emails all day long of like, I thought this might appeal to you, and it's just like the most revolting thing in the world. I'm like, thanks, I'm so glad you associated that with me.
I saw this and I thought of you. All right, well, one more question right here, because you had your hand up.
I was just going to say, so you mentioned that you just called scientists, and I'm wondering, does nobody have like a massive library of scientists just at their disposal with their phone numbers?
So I think that Julia and Evan might be better equipped to answer this question. So, massive library. I will say that most of the scientists that I don't know, there's not always perfect overlap with the scientists I'm calling and the scientists that, the broadcast team is calling, though Nova has been on TV for over 40 years, so there's probably a lot of overlap there. I really just write to people and explain what the show's about, explain, who the audience is, and many scientists, especially once they find out that it's for kids, they're like, sure, I'm happy to help.
Great. Well, thank you. Let's thank Anna Rothschild, Gross Science. And that is our show for the evening. I would like to thank, of course, Coolidge Corner Theater for hosting us, Jackson Hole Science Media Awards for helping produce this, and of course, AAAS. So thank you all for coming. It was loved having you here, and we just can't say enough about the Coolidge Corner Theater and how nice they were to let us be here.